Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 23 today after David had escaped from Keilah and Saul seemed to give up the expedition, as we see in the top of the screen on the left side. But as you see immediately in verse 14, Saul sought him every day, and in verse 15 we see Saul had come to seek out his life. So as I was suggesting last time, the chase between Saul and David is hardly over and won't end until the entire book is over and Saul and Jonathan are both dead. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we're continuing in the chiastic structure of the second half of 1 Samuel, and today we're moving into the first of the brown sections here, the first of the E parts, parallel here. And as we'll see when we get to chapter 24, there are many, many parallels between the scene in chapter 24 and 26, leading many scholars to ask, how are we supposed to read that as two separate incidents or two reports of the same one? We'll get there when we get there. But first, we have a very poignant scene today, the last meeting between David and Jonathan. And the writer inserts it here in between the various scenes of David and Saul chasing David around throughout everywhere, and it leads to a very poignant encounter with them because it's the last time they'll talk while they're alive. And so let's go back and look at our key words, and we'll see we're in this middle paragraph here. We looked at this part last time, and we'll look at this next time. And you see there aren't a lot of specific key words in this section. It's really not organized that way, although we see hand continuing and the question of seeking, as we just saw, is continuing. But more specifically to how this is framed in two small chiasms. The first two verses, 14 and 15, as you can see on the right side, are an ABA chiasm. And then the little encounter between Jonathan and David, only 3 verses, but it forms a nice tight 5-part chiasm, as you can see there. So the authors have moved away from looking at the big picture of these stories in terms of key words to continue, down to these two little portraits. And in many ways, these paired chiasms are like a little diptych, because at the center is both is Yahweh's will. So we see in the first one, the center is Yahweh did not give David up into Saul's hand. So we see Yahweh's protection. And then out of the mouth of Jonathan, we see down here, you shall be king over Israel, and I shall be second to you. Of course, that will never happen. So as we look at this, let's keep in mind that we're seeing this in the midst of Saul chasing after David, and we have to wonder if Jonathan's here. Where's Michal? We last saw Michal when she protected David from her father by putting a dummy basically in the bed and covering it with goat hair and saying that was David, and then acknowledging that she had helped him escape. But here he is out traveling all around, and we saw that he's taking care of his parents and his family, his brothers, and put them in a safe place. But where's Michal in all this? And I ask that because we're going to see her again, but by the time we see her again, David's going to have another wife, Abigail, the widow of Nabal, in chapter 25. So just to keep in mind that we'd seen both Michal and Jonathan side with David over against their father, but we're only going to see Jonathan here. So let's look at the close-up at our scene starting on verse 14. David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness. The word for remain here, yeshev, is one we've seen a number of times and literally means to sit down or to settle. But here it's in contrast with Jonathan, who we'll see here stood up. So while David's sitting down in the strongholds in the wilderness, Jonathan is setting out to come and visit him. Here it starts off generically. We looked at before the word metzed for stronghold can mean hunting ground. Here, as Edelman notes, there's also a different word that we saw in chapter 22 and we'll see in 24, Metsudath, here for stronghold. The word that we're not seeing here, Metsudath, is more specifically just a generic term for a fortified place or a safe place, whereas the word here specifically implies hunting grounds, and of course who's being hunted for is David. So this would imply there's wildlife and things that people go out and seeking food there in this wilderness. But the wilderness is specified. First we hear generically strongholds in the wilderness, and then we hear the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. So let's look at our atlas, and then we'll also look at Google Maps to see what that looks like today. So here's Ziph and the wilderness of Ziph, and they were just here in Keilah. So we're still staying in this relatively small area here. We'll see David will eventually go down to En-Gadi here, and his parents are on the other side in Moab, being protected on the other side of the Dead Sea there. So this wilderness of Ziph is only mentioned in this passage, and it's parallel in the entire Bible, other than the beginning of Psalm 54, which is described as a psalm of David when Saul was chasing him in the wilderness of Ziph. So we don't know anything else about it. It's only mentioned as a place here, although there's a person, obscure person named Ziph somewhere else in the Bible. So we really know nothing about that. We can't really focus on that. But here they are down in this section. The only one thing worth saying is it's the farthest from Saul's home in Gibeah that that Saul's going to be chasing him down in this section of the story. So Saul sought him every day. And here's the keyword seek that was just showing the keywords. I won't bring it up twice in our immediate scene and then framing more widely. But Yahweh did not give him into his hands. And we've inferred earlier that David is protected by Yahweh, and a number of scholars have asserted it as a fact, but it hasn't said so explicitly in the text. And now is when it does, that Yahweh is the one who's been protecting David throughout this time. Described interestingly as did not give him into his hand. Only here in the voice of the narrator of 16 times, as Falkman notes, of giving into the hand in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So here are the voice of the narrator and highlighting the hand thing. And so putting our chiasm back up so you can see how this is framed. So the second half is David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, adding Horesh here, repeating the first part though, when he learned, or literally he saw here, that Saul had come out to seek his life. Literally, he can't have seen because Saul's not within visual range, but saw in the mental sense of seeing there. Note that sometimes knowledge of one of them approaching, or where David is, Saul approaching David or Saul knowing where David is expressed in terms of yada, knowing, but here in terms of saw. And as we've been looking at, it's just continuing this long theme of rumors and indirect communication by which people get to know where everybody else is. So this is the only one in our immediate scene here, but we'll see the Ziphites come up to Saul directly. That's one of the few times we'll see that we know exactly who it is that's communicating. Usually it's just the passive voice. He heard or he learned or he found out, something like that. Once David knows and sees that Saul has come out to seek his life, then suddenly it's Jonathan. And it's really a wonderful little scene here because we haven't seen Jonathan for a while. I'll show you in just a moment. We'll go back to Jonathan's previous scenes. But it really comes out of nowhere. And there's all kinds of questions we can ask. How does Jonathan know where David is? Presumably, he knows because Saul knows. And so if he's still hanging around with his father. But last time we saw Jonathan and Saul was swearing at Jonathan on his mother and offering him a lot of terrible things and recognizing that Jonathan had sided with David. And that Jonathan was not with him. So perhaps we're supposed to understand that was a momentary argument. In the end, they do die together and they're at war together, so it's not like they're completely alienated. But we just don't really know much about their relationship at this point. It certainly must be tense. So notice it's highlighting Saul's son, even though we're highlighting here David's relationship with them. He's still Saul's son, and Jonathan will highlight my father Saul twice in the next verses we'll see. So he stood up and came to David at Horesh, and there he strengthened his hand through the Lord. This is, of course, strengthening David's hand, not strengthening Jonathan's hand, and that'll be parallel on the other side of the chiasm with the covenant here. We've seen the word for strengthening a number of times. Here it was in the Goliath story. It's not about being strengthened, but it is about the strength involved there. And we'll see it one more time in the end of 1 Samuel. So he says to him, and we don't know anything about this scene otherwise. Notice that David doesn't say anything. So we don't hear David go, Jonathan, it's so great to see you, or where you've been, or let me fill you in on everything that's happened since we were last together. There's no happy reunion like that. There's just simply this statement from Jonathan here. Do not be afraid. And as Edelman notes, Jonathan takes on the role of a priest here, pronouncing the cultic phrase, fear not, and reassuring the king-elect of the divine plan. But interesting, the last time we heard fear not was David to the priest Abiathar. So if Edelman's right that saying do not be afraid is a priestly role, well, then David was playing the priest to the priest Abiathar just a few verses earlier at the end of chapter 22. But he says do not be afraid. We've not heard that David was afraid of Saul. We heard that he was afraid of the Philistines. So perhaps Jonathan knows something we don't know, or perhaps he's perceiving it in a way that we can't in a text, or perhaps he's just guessing. And he's just trying to reassure him. But here it is, do not be afraid. The hand of my father Saul shall not find you. How does he know that? What basis does he have? Is it simply a hope? Fackelman notes below, Jonathan presents himself as a son who need not break with Saul just because he loves David. And maybe that's true, and we're not going to find out any more about their relationship, as I was noting, until we find them in battle together at the end. So there's no reason that we think that Jonathan has any specific knowledge of why Saul won't find him. It's simply a hope, but he doesn't invoke Yahweh for that point here. It's not that Yahweh has told him or that he believes that. It's just his own statement. But at the center of the chiasm is the point, you shall be king over Israel, and I shall be second to you. And isn't that a poignant comment here? And as the note below from Jennings, who has written a lot about the homoerotic elements of the relationship between David and Jonathan, as many have, adds here, we are offered a glimpse of the abolition of male rivalry on the basis of love. In this way, the two may constitute co-command of the militia and so of Israel. The homoerotic bond thus appears to subvert the whole hierarchical order in which such relationships are otherwise inscribed. And we don't have to buy into the entire argument of Jennings that David and Jonathan were engaged in a homosexual relationship. It's never described that way, but they certainly are described as a close bond. And as we'll see in a moment, David will sing over the dead bodies of Jonathan and Saul that love of you is greater than love of women. So it's not an unreasonable premise, but it's not required by the text. But certainly the text does require us to see that this is the closest relationship David has with anybody. His own family or his wives or his children or anybody else, although he'll be pretty sad at the death of Absalom, as we'll see way later. And the poignancy, of course, is we know that they will not be co-command, that Jonathan will die with his father and not with David. And so our scene here concludes with the two of them made a covenant before Yahweh. David remained at Horish and Jonathan went home, literally to his house, although we're not sure where his house is. Presumably it's in Gibeah, where his father lives, but we just simply don't know, and we won't see him again. So given that, let's take a moment to go back over the relationship with Jonathan and David in terms of their bond, and we can see what the writers have established for us when we look at the larger pattern. So you can see that I put in blue the covenant element, and I put in pink the love element. And we see how this phrase, loved him as his own life, some translations very misleading say as soul, but the Hebrew nephesh does not mean soul at any level. It means one's life. Nephesh applies to all living beings. I don't think any theologian is going to argue that all the animals and things have souls. All that soul stuff's based on Plato, not based on the Bible. So I've translated it here more accurately to the Hebrew. He loved him as his own life, and it's repeated here. So you see there's a little chiasm in the middle of that as well. And he made a covenant because he loved him as his own life. And that first one we saw that he stripped off the symbols of his own privilege as the prince and gave those all to David. Then a couple chapters later, after Saul's beginning to chase down David with his spear, we saw this scene where Jonathan offers his own life and if his father does anything for David. And of course, that's not going to happen. But he makes a covenant now with the house of David, not just with David individually, but with the house of David, highlighting that there's a monarchy here and about to emerge, and he's on that side. Offering, may Yahweh seek out the enemies of David. And of course, there's a wonderfully ironic element there. Is that Saul? Is that the Philistines? Is it somebody else that we'll see along the way? It doesn't mean Yahweh will do that, but that's Jonathan's hope, even if it means causing his own death, as it indirectly may. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own life. Repeated for a third time. But notice where the intention is. Jonathan made David swear again. This is all Jonathan's initiative. Jonathan made a covenant with David. Jonathan loved him as his own life. And again. And Jonathan made David swear, for he loved him his own life. And the scene we saw here, the two of them made a covenant before Yahweh, and we don't hear anything about David. But then finally, in 2 Samuel, after Jonathan and David are dead, we hear this classic image here, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. And notice, your love to me. Greatly beloved were you to me. That's as close anywhere as we get to the text saying that David loves anybody. And that's really important to hear because it never says that David loves Yahweh, even though it says Yahweh is with David and loves David. This is the closest we get. So whether we decide that this is a homosexual relationship, or simply, quote unquote, simply, not to make it lesser, a homoerotic relationship without necessarily a physical expression of that. Although Rembrandt shows at least this much physical expression of it, we can certainly see that that's the tightest bond and perhaps the most vulnerable anybody is with David. David's not necessarily vulnerable here. He doesn't speak and he doesn't affirm it. Jonathan does all the doing and all the talking. But David is certainly with Jonathan in this, and when Jonathan is dead, he's lost certainly the man who seemed to be his best friend during the time that he was seeking to embody the covenant with Yahweh and the people that Samuel had chosen him for. So with that, next time we'll see the Ziphites tell Saul where David is, and the chase will continue. See you for that next time.